Good afternoon. It's 2:30 and we have many people, nearly 50 at present online, and a nice gathering here live in the Trafalgar Room at IISS Arundel House. It's not just a courtesy for me to say this, it's a genuine expression of emotion. I'm delighted to have Nigel Inkster talk to us about the Great Decoupling. He wrote this book 2.5 years ago. I read it within a couple of weeks of publication, I think 2 sittings. And if you haven't read it, it's an exciting and gripping read. It has the special feature of drawing immensely from Mandarin language sources. Great understanding the author has both of Chinese culture and the particular culture of the Chinese Communist Party. He has also tutored himself over the last 10 or 15 years on the minutiae of new technologies that are now elements of global and particularly G2 competition, if I can use that styling. He entitled his book, The Great Decoupling. Since then, there's been an attempt by some people to triangulate and say, let's hope not for a great decoupling, but some sort of astute de-risking. The degree to which de-risking migrates towards full decoupling or cleaves closer to business as usual is, I think, still an open theater of play. It now still looks like de-risking will get closer to decoupling than it will stick to some modern version of business as usual. But the variety of sanctions, counter-sanctions, technological warfare that is being displayed is quite something. About 7 or 8 weeks ago, he published the 2nd edition of this book that has a chunky epilogue to it that brings it up to date to at least 2 or 3 months ago. We at the IISS are doing a lot of advising to companies on this issue. We're lucky that we have Mayor Nowens here as well, who is the person who ran our China Connects project that has 8,000 or 9,000 data points on it on what the Chinese used to call the digital Silk Road, and now modestly shy away from thus styling it, but still wish to project into those geographies. And most companies who seek our assessment on China are wanting to know more about this great decoupling, and we're fortunate to have the principal expert on this here. Nigel will speak to us about his book and his epilogue. We'll take questions afterwards. We now are getting closer to 75 online, so you've got at least 100 people to whom you are now speaking. Nigel, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, shall I go?
As you like.
Yeah, okay. Well, John, thank you very much for that very comprehensive and kind introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming here, whether you've come in person or online. When it comes to the Great Decoupling, I should actually make confess that this is a term that I plagiarized and or purloined from the lady sitting in the corner there, Diana Sholova, who I think trademarked the term. Yeah. Bought the domain. Right. Okay, yeah, and very kindly allowed me to make use of it. And so what I'd like to do is just briefly talk about the rationale for writing the book that I did, and then look at the situation we're in now within the context of the issues that this book addresses, and starting with why I wrote this book. In 2016, I wrote an earlier book for IISS on China's cyber power. This was at a time when everybody was being very exercised by the phenomenon of state-sponsored industrial cyber espionage on the part of China. And my purpose in writing that book was to highlight the fact that China was of concern for many more reasons than just industrial cyber espionage, and it was about the use of China's growing technology power to shape the international environment in ways favorable to its interests. The second book came at a time when the Trump administration had just begun to kick off its trade and technology wars with China. And I thought that it might be useful to try and set what was happening in a broader cultural and historical context, to understand why China was behaving and in the way that it did. And so it's really looking at a situation of China as a civilizational state, empire, call it what you will, which for most of recorded history had been a global technological superpower responsible for probably 50% of the world's pre-industrial revolution inventions, but which in around the 15th century began to go into reverse somewhat and to lose track of some of the inventions and capabilities that it had pioneered, and critically failed to develop a culture of science, which put it at a significant disadvantage with Western nations who were just moving into that space. And the net effect of this was, in the mid-19th century, China, one of the greatest and most prosperous nations on earth, suddenly found itself, so to speak, reduced from hero to zero, and being castigated in the Western media, at least, as, quote, the sick man of Asia, unquote. And really, I would say that the modern history of China for the last certainly 170 years has been about how China can develop a modern identity while maintaining a unique Chinese civilizational focus. And that, I think, is a journey that China is still on. And understanding that, I think, is important in terms of what makes China behave in the way that it does, and why its preoccupation with technology is so overreaching. If you look, for example, at recent speeches by Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping, there's been a huge focus on technology and catching up, and this impetus to catch up with and to overtake the West, Ganchao, is front and center of everything the Chinese Communist Party is now trying to do. I'd now like to take a look at US-China relations broadly before narrowing in on the technology space. US-China relations have gone through remarkable shifts during the last couple of centuries. There have been periods of total estrangement, downright enmity, actual war in the Korean Peninsula, and proxy war in Vietnam, combined with periods of relatively close approximation, the Nixon rapprochement in the 1970s, and close collaboration in the areas of military and intelligence against the Soviet Union during the late 1970s and 1980s. But even during the best of times, the US-China relationship was never easy. There were some quite fundamental differences of perspective, of values, and of course, ideology that always lurked in the background. When China came blinking into the daylight after the end of the Cultural Revolution and began its reform and opening up policies under Deng Xiaoping, it suited both sides to ignore and to paper over the cracks. China, for quite a long period of time, was happy to play the role of a status quo power and to, so to speak, free ride on US security goods in order to enjoy the space to pursue economic development, which was its primary, if not unique, focus at that time. But as China grew stronger, more prosperous economically, and started to develop military capabilities, the cracks started to appear and could no longer realistically be papered over. And we now find ourselves in a situation where both China and the United States are looking at each other on the basis of what I would characterize as mistaken assumptions and different forms of exceptionalism. I mean, American exceptionalism is something we've become very familiar with. It's been around for an awful long time. Chinese exceptionalism has been around, but we weren't required to confront it until very recently. But I mean, exceptionalism is nothing new. I mean, every civilizational state empire to varying degrees has, exercised exceptionalism. It's hardly surprising in the circumstances that China and the USA are in this situation. We've got a situation in which the United States now feels that this long period of engagement that it had with China has been a failure insofar as it did not bring about a social and political approximation. I have to say, in retrospect, it was, quite an arrogant assumption to think that this would actually be the case. And I think realistically, those Americans who were involved with China from a professional capacity never really expected that to happen. Realistically, I think what they were hoping for was a kind of China that was authoritarian light, a bit like Singapore maybe. But of course, it hasn't turned out like that. And it's interesting now that, I mean, really, it's pretty clear to everybody that relationships are as bad as they've ever been since before the Nixon rapprochement. I mean, China's foreign minister, Qin Gang, actually said that in terms the other day. Both sides are talking past each other. Neither side seems willing to respect each other's sensibilities. And both sides are saying one thing and doing something else. When Presidents Biden and Xi met in Indonesia last year, Biden said that he did not intend to, subvert or overthrow China or prevent its development. And Xi Jinping said that China did not want to displace the United States. Well, to put it mildly, neither statement was entirely without terminological inexactitudes. And we are now, and it's actually very interesting that the use of the term the rules-based order came into vogue around 2010, precisely the moment at which I think the splits were beginning to no longer be capable of being hidden. I mean, I don't remember during the course of my entire government career ever hearing the words rule-based international order once. And the fact that people are talking about it so much now is, I think, a very interesting indication of the extent to which they perceive it's under threat. That whether there was ever a single rules-based international order is perhaps a moot point. So we've got a situation in which the two sides are pushing in opposite directions. In the Chinese case, I think there is a high degree of schizophrenia. On the one hand, China's leaders, imbued with a sense of Marxist determinism, historical determinism, are saying the East is rising, the West is in decline. At the same time, China's leaders regard the West, and particularly the United States, as still capable of doing a lot of damage and as now being involved in encirclement, containment, and suppression of China's rise. At the same time, the United States, I think, is looking at what it perceives as a threat from China that risks that challenges its vision of itself as the kind of global leader. And any psychologist will tell you that the pain of losing something you've got is far in excess of the pain that you experience from not having it in the first place. And I think this is very much of a driver in the US case. Interesting that at the end of the Trump administration, China had convinced itself that the US was about to indulge in one last act of madness, which might even have extended to enticing the PLA to launch an armed attack against US forces. That is the kind of degree to which the relationship has deteriorated. And we're looking essentially at an action-reaction dynamic, a classic security dilemma, in which the actions of the United States and China against each other are as consequential in some regards as the internal social and political dynamics of the countries themselves. What the United States does in the Pacific region shapes Chinese behavior to a very significant degree. Some Chinese behaviors are also very, sort of instrumental in shaping US responses. This is almost a situation like Sherlock Holmes described, in which Holmes and Moriarty are locked in combat on the Reichenbach Falls, with all the attendant risks that carries. I now like to move on to the technology sector, because this has been front and center, as I said, in the way the relationship has evolved. Since the beginning of reform and opening up, the United States was deeply engaged in helping China develop its own technology sector. China's leaders were very quick to appreciate the importance of modern technologies, information communication technologies in particular, long before they actually acquired them themselves. And once they did get them, they were able to move very quickly to develop them. We saw a situation in which the United States kind of got out of US technology companies, went, so to speak, fabless, to use the term of art, rather than making their own chips. There's only one company, Intel, that still does that in America. They outsourced chip manufacture and lots of other technology manufacture to China. We saw companies like Microsoft setting up very consequential research facilities in Beijing, US technology companies investing in all sorts of capabilities. Companies like Apple, for example, making the bulk of their equipment in China. And we saw a lot of young Chinese engineers and scientists doing apprenticeships, so to speak, in US universities and in Silicon Valley, and then going back to China to develop their own indigenous capabilities. We also saw some other forms of indigenous development. Huawei, for example, Ren Pengfei, a Chinese military engineer who started small and turned Huawei into the behemoth that it has since become, and Jack Ma Yun, who had no technical background whatsoever, but could see the commercial applications of these technologies and built the giant organization that is Alibaba. At this point, I think it's probably important to puncture a couple of myths in relation to China's role in the global technology sector. Initially, it may have been the case that China's attraction for foreign entrepreneurs was cheap labor, cheap land, and a variety of other incentives, tax holidays, and the like. But that has long since ceased to be the case. And I would refer, for example, to some remarks Tim Cook made a few years ago, where he said, people think that, the attraction for us of China is the low wage economy and abundance of workers. He said, I don't know which China these people are going to, but it's not the one I'm operating in. And he said, the value to us of China is in the deep clusters of expertise that have developed in various industrial processes. And he took the example of iPods. These things have hundreds of components in them. As you can imagine, they're all pretty small and require very, very sophisticated industrial tooling. And Cook said, if I wanted to have a meeting on industrial tooling, in America, I might be able to fill the room. In China, I would fill multiple football fields. That I think is indicative of the way things have developed, that China has, through investment in infrastructure and incentives to China's very vibrant private sector, created this deep ecosystem of manufacturing. Has China got weaknesses? Yes, most certainly. There are where China does, I think, lag behind still is in foundational science. This has always been an issue. And if any of you are interested to do so, there's a very intriguing presentation that you can find on YouTube by the former editor-in-chief of Science and Technology Daily, Mr. Liu Yadong, which has the subtitle in it, 你的国没那么厉害, your country isn't that fantastic, in which he says it's all very well, talking about, making much of China's, successes and achievements, but the fact is, a country the size of China has produced precisely 3 Nobel Prize winners. It's a tiny country like Israel has produced dozens and dozens. We have a certain amount of ground to make up. And that, I think, is true. This is an area of weakness. But against that, I think where China has considerable strengths is in its ability to develop and expand the application of what Jeff Ding, now professor at Columbia University, calls general purpose technologies, an example being electricity. Once you've got the basic concept of electricity, everything that happens thereafter is a function of incremental developments generally produced by people who are working in the sector and over time realize the potential for innovation. And this is something where China is still very capable. The simple fact is there is nowhere else in the world at the moment that can replicate China's depth of manufacturing expertise. India is trying to do so, but we've just seen in the high-tech sector a big purported deal between Vedanta and Foxconn to develop semiconductors in India fall apart for various reasons. Not least the lack of necessary infrastructure and the lack of sufficiently educated workforce. So that is a factor. There are other things that China needs to worry about: changing demographics. The labor, the supplies of cheap labor are running out. China itself reckons that by 2025, they're going to have 30 million vacancies in the manufacturing sector. Another problem is that a lot of young, educated Chinese do not want to go into this business. The Confucian philosopher Mencius Mengzi said, amongst many other things, those who work with their minds rule, those who work with their hands are ruled. Lao Xinzhe, zhi ren, Lao Li zhe, zhi yu ren. And this has left a very, very powerful impression on the sort of Chinese psyche. Anyone who's educated doesn't want to get their hands dirty. You know, when IKEA first set up shop in China in the 1990s, they quickly realized that this self-assembly was, as far as Chinese, urbanites concerned, was for the birds. You know, nobody was going to sully their, lower their dignity by engaging in manual labor. So IKEA actually had to set up teams of people to go around and assemble this stuff. So there are problems here. But the simple fact is that up until very recently, the whole advanced technology sector has been a product of deep entanglement, in which the contributions of China and the United States are equal but different. We now come to the whole question of decoupling and de-risking. A lot of factors have led to the emergence of de-risking. Obviously, Trump's trade and tech war, but also COVID was a remarkable wake-up call in terms of reminding everybody just how fragile some of these global supply chains were, and to what extent China represented a single point of failure in so many of these supply chains. And that was the point, I think, at which a lot of companies began to rethink their involvement with China. This coincided with a period during which China itself was starting to make life rather less welcoming for foreign companies than had previously been the case. A lot more regulation, a lot more interference from the Communist Party. Of course, the extent to which that is true varied enormously from sector to sector. It's very difficult to generalize, because there are many Western companies in China who are continuing to do very well and have every intention of remaining there and even increasing their investment. There are others who say they are, but are actually slow walking their investment, and there are others that are looking to diversify, reduce their exposure, and or get out. All these things are happening. The other factor, of course, where China can kind of has itself to blame, is that for some time now, China has been pushing the button on technology self-sufficiency. The various programs have been developed and made in China 2025, which was designed to significantly increase Chinese manufacturers in key areas. When the Chinese realized that the Americans took exception to this, they deep sixed the term made in China 2025, but the programs remain intact and are even expanding. So we saw a number of other things happening in the tech sector. The US began under Trump to go after Huawei and to pressurize allies and partners to exclude Huawei from 5G networks. In the UK case, the Trump administration threatened to withhold intelligence cooperation if we didn't get with the program, and indicative of how serious this became. China, of course, has reacted very strongly against the whole concept of decoupling, arguing for a continuation of globalized trade and presenting China as a country that is open for business, whilst at the same time walking very much in the other direction towards self-sufficiency. So again, there is a certain amount of schizophrenia in the Chinese position. And reaction, strong Chinese reaction to decoupling has been somewhat mitigated when I think it was Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, first coined the term de-risking as an alternative. So yes, it's true that Western companies are reducing their exposure in China, looking to develop alternative capabilities elsewhere where they can, to remove single points of failure from the supply chain. But this is not, full-scale decoupling. It's something much less. And initially, actually, when China heard this from the European Union, they thought, yeah, okay, we can live with this. Then when the US government adopted it, all of a sudden it became a conspiracy to create an alternative world trading system from which China was to be excluded. I think they've slightly come off that now, and a recent series of comments by some serious Chinese academics suggests that a slightly more moderated approach, but at the same time, a sense that de-risking is first and foremost about making sure China doesn't get the technology that it needs. The aim is to ensure that the West maintains its hegemony, keeps China down, and they've coined the term de-Sinicization for the process, 去中国化. To describe the intent and effect of de-risking. So they're certainly very unhappy about it. I think the key thing in all of this, what has really brought matters to a head, was the decisions by the Biden government last year to impose what on the face of it looked like very severe restrictions on Chinese access to advanced technologies. And the trigger for this was a speech made by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to the Special Competitive Studies Group, an organization set up by former Google chairman Eric Schmidt to look at how the United States could maintain a competitive edge in advanced technologies. And I'll read the relevant section of Sullivan's speech because it's very critical. Sorry. Said, we have to revisit the long-standing premise of maintaining relative advantages over competitors in certain key technologies. We previously maintained a sliding scale approach that said we need to stay only a couple of generations ahead. That is not the strategic environment we're in today. Given the foundational nature of certain technologies, such as advanced logic and memory chips, we must maintain as large a lead as possible. That was given effect the next month when the State Department, when the Department of Commerce announced very substantial restrictions on logic chips that could be sold to China, and in particular graphic processing units, which are GPUs, which are critical in the training of large language models for artificial intelligence. The restriction, the level on GPUs was 600 data transmission speeds at and above 600 gigabits per second. And that, collectively, the collective effect of what the US did was to not only say that China wasn't going to be able to develop the most advanced production nodes of semiconductors, but that they weren't even going to be able to carry on producing what they already could. I mean, the United States has denied China access to the most advanced extreme ultraviolet lithography that is used to make very, very high-end chips, 7.5 nanometers, 3 and soon to be 2. They've been denied this access under the Wassenaar arrangement, but they're now imposing they've now lined up the Dutch government to get ASML, the only company in the world that produces this equipment, to deny China access to deep ultraviolet lithography techniques, which actually they've already got. This is a pretty serious thing. Apart from anything else, ASML isn't going to carry on providing spare parts or maintenance for what China's already got here. In addition, we've seen the United States come up with the Chips and Science Act, which provides for very substantial incentives, financial incentives for US companies to invest in indigenous chip manufacture in the United States, but on condition that those receiving funding from the US government refrain from making comparable investments in China. In addition, of course, the United States has for some time, starting under the Trump administration, been applying more rigorously regulations that limit the amount of technology, US technology, that in particular components and systems that can be sold to China. So this is a pretty big deal, and it's a big deal because China can't yet make these things for itself. Obviously, it can't make the most advanced chips because the US won't let it get the equipment to do it. I mean, China can make chips to quite high levels of sophistication in the 40, 28 nanometer nodes, memory chips in particular, but they're not good at logic chips. They're also good at, they've also got a kind of major global role in packaging and testing of semiconductors. But there are these big areas where they still lag behind. The Chinese government has invested well over $100 billion in trying to get Chinese companies to move closer to where they need to be, including a so-called big fund of $40 billion, which last year they looked at and discovered had produced nothing useful, and a number of people are now undergoing investigations for corruption as a result of that particular exercise. But the bottom line is China can't make these things. And even if the situation is such that even if they were able to get the actual equipment for making them, they also need enormously complex supply chains of very sophisticated inputs, chemicals refined to 99.999 recurring levels of purity, lenses, mirrors, pipes, valves, all machined to similar levels of tolerance. And all these things are made in the West. So the US has kind of got a lockhold here. And even if China does move forward, it's going to be a kind of Achilles and the tortoise situation, in which Achilles never catches the tortoise. Even if China were to make sort of 7 nanometer chips, by that stage, TSMC, the Taiwanese corporation that provides about 90% of the world's advanced chips, will be on 2 nanometers, and conceivably even 1. There will come a point at which potentially Moore's law kicks it, sort of runs out of road at the atomic level, though conceivably with artificial intelligence, it might be possible to manufacture at the sub-atomic level. We just don't know. But that remains to be seen. Of course, this brings us to the whole issue of Taiwan, because Taiwan is the center of the tussle between the United States and China. And again, technology plays an important role here. Taiwan likes to talk about the TSMC foundries as its silicon shield. The argument is that China is so, would not want to damage these capabilities in a conflict, and therefore will refrain from engaging in a conflict. I think that probably is a misplaced assessment. There are also various reports around, which I think are disinformation, about if it ever came to a conflict, the United States would bomb the TSMC foundries rather than allow them to fall into Chinese hands. I very much doubt that because, as I just mentioned before, without all the inputs that they would need to run these foundries, if China were to take them over, they would simply acquire a lot of very expensive and rapidly deteriorating industrial plant that they couldn't use. So I don't think that is going to be a factor. Taiwan is a big issue. And of course, Taiwan plays a big role in technology, but I don't think semiconductors are going to be the proximate cause of a conflict between the United States and China. This is driven by other factors. In China's case, and it's something I think Western policymakers significantly underrate. Thucydides said that there are three drivers for conflict: fear, honor, and advantage. Phobos, ke timis, ke ophilos. And I think in China's case, the fact that this is about honor is something that Western policymakers do not afford sufficient attention, pay sufficient attention to. So we've got the situation in which, to some extent, the gloss has worn off the Chinese economy. The days of double-digit GDP growth are over, and there are now serious concerns about whether China might potentially be heading in the direction of Japanese-style deflationary decade. I'm not an economist, I can't really comment on that, but certainly people are looking at this. We have got a process of decoupling, de-risking, which in some cases amounts to decoupling, starting to happen. It's at uneven rates and very difficult to say how it will play out. In the case of high tech, US tech companies are very much opposed to the whole question of decoupling. It was noteworthy that when, for example, US Department of Commerce banned the sale of advanced GPUs to China, NVIDIA, the corporation that made them, promptly made an alternative GPU that came just underneath the limits and has been selling that. Also, of course, I should mention that China's been able to access these GPUs through cloud providers because, bizarrely, the US Department of Commerce didn't sort of think to develop measures to limit access to these chips. There's nothing illegal about a company like Amazon renting the use of A100 GPUs to the bits of the Chinese machine that are working on nuclear weapons, and this is actually happening at the moment. So there is work to be done here. Also, these chips are actually quite easy to smuggle; they're not very big, in contrast to the machinery for making them, which you would need several Boeing 737s to smuggle. So this is happening. It's happening at an uneven pace. America has now persuaded TSMC to build 2 foundries in Arizona. These foundries, as far as I can make out, are already well behind schedule. A key reason being an absence of suitably qualified US workers to build them. Also noteworthy that Arizona is a state not renowned for its abundant supplies of water, and water is a key input to these chips. 2021, Taiwan had a climate change-induced drought, and the government had to decide between giving water to farmers, who are a key electoral constituency, and giving it to TSMC. Well, they gave it to TSMC, but it does raise questions about exactly how much more of this stuff you can do. Where does this leave? Firstly, the US, then other players. Obviously, the United States and Western Europe generally have begun to realize the penalties that come from outsourcing manufacturing industry elsewhere. The collective loss of skills and capabilities is something that cannot easily be resurrected. It's not a question of national security so much as a question of national industrial patrimony. If you don't have these capabilities, or if you had them and you lose them, you lose a lot more than just the ability to manufacture a particular semiconductor or widget. And that fact is now starting to come home. The emergence of a world which I guess we could characterize as post-Western and at once bipolar and multipolar, a sort of complex mix of the two, incentivizes countries, big and small, to move in the direction of greater self-sufficiency in a variety of capabilities. The extent to which that is possible, realistic, desirable, varies considerably. When it comes to advanced semiconductors, I don't think it's remotely realistic. There are only two players, in town, the USA and China. India may one day get there, but it's still, far away. And that, I think, is an important factor in shaping the way global technology is evolving. It impacts things like artificial intelligence, large language models. Though in China's case, I suspect that restricted access to GPUs will play less of a role than the Chinese Communist Party's own imperatives for ideological control. But we'll have to see how that plays out, still in the early days. But the fact is that in this world that I've just referred to, the post-Western world that is bipolar and multipolar, and which has actually provided an enabling environment for a number of middle powers, it remains the case that in certain areas, countries may well find themselves having to decide between one or the other of the two major poles when it comes to these technologies. What are the implications? Well, we don't know. When I wrote this book, The Great Decoupling, one of my concerns was that Western demagogues were quick to disparage science when science did not deliver the answers that it wanted. And it wouldn't be the first time that a civilization had lost touch with the things that had made it great. We saw it with China, which is a key factor of the book. We also saw it in the Islamic world, which in the medieval period was on the cutting edge, and then subsequently lapsed into obscurantism and backwardness. So it's always been a concern for me that the potential of the West to go in a similar direction. But I think my basic point, which I will conclude with, is I don't think this is a contest where there can be winners. I just don't see how it can happen. What does success look like in this bifurcated world? Nobody's been able to describe it in a way that I find remotely satisfactory. And extending from that, I think, logically, it is the situation we have at the moment is one in which potentially we all end up being losers to some degree if what is happening creates inefficiencies, increased costs, and disincentives to innovate and develop and push out new general purpose technologies, which we will rely upon or need to solve some of the problems that we are facing. So this is not, this is to end on not a very optimistic note. I think we have just seen China and the US attempting to kind of put a floor under the deterioration in the relationship. But nobody, I think, seriously believes that this has changed the fundamentals that put these two great powers at odds with each other. And it remains to be seen how they are going to manage these differences and how these differences will impact on all the other countries that to varying degrees are going to be affected by them. Thank you.
Brilliant. Nigel, thank you very much for skimming so briskly over very deep waters of expertise and knowledge here. It does sound to me that while countries will place a floor on disagreements, they will continue to dig into deeper and deeper basements to find deeper and deeper floors from the trends that we've seen. Two quick questions, and we've got three from the audience, and anyone wants one here, please raise your hand. First, I think you agree with Chris Miller, who is the other person who's written a book on the subject of chip war, who said that actually Japan, China, others would actually fall faster and faster behind the sort of specific Taiwanese lead with US assistance. So if you could just sort of reconfirm that that's also your judgment. Secondly, on the other side of the scale, I've spoken and I think you know about whom I'm speaking to, one or two sort of Chinese entrepreneurs who said, this is really irritating, but we still think that within the next couple of years we'll do fine with 14 nanometer chips that will deal with 80% of our capability, even some of our military capability needs. We can get going 14 nanometers, and it'll take us maybe 5 to 8 years to get to 6 nanometers. You don't really need 2 and 1 nanometers. This is kind of sort of luxury chip making. Yeah. Is that just being cocky on the Chinese side, or is there some truth behind that?
Not entirely. Firstly, the TSM, the Taiwan point. I mean, TSMC is a remarkable phenomenon. Its founder, Morris Chang, when he set it up in 1989, really bet the farm on going for the high-end semiconductor manufacturer, and that bet to date has paid off. There are various reasons why it might not continue indefinitely. As I mentioned, sort of little practicalities like, is there enough water for more foundries in a water-stressed country? All of these things. But yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to see how in the short to medium term anybody can come close to replacing TSMC when it comes to the top end stuff. On the second point, the people you talk to do have a very valid and relevant point, which is the world depends to a very significant degree on semiconductors that are not of the most advanced production nodes. And we saw when the pandemic ended, a global shortage of the kind of semiconductors needed for the automotive sector. It really had a major impact. So I think it is part of China's calculation that if the worst comes to the worst, China still has a very significant advantage in terms of the volume of lower end semiconductors that it can manufacture, that we will still need. And so they will still be able to keep their heads above water. I think that is an absolutely valid argument to make. And again, it goes to the point that having outsourced so much manufacture overseas, it's really hard to bring it back. I mean, Morris Jang, talking about these foundries, TSMC foundries in Arizona, said quite bluntly, I don't think they're going to work. Firstly, costs in America are stubbornly 25% higher than they are in Taiwan. Secondly, I don't think American workers are up to the task. My guys work round the clock, do whatever it takes to keep these foundries going because we can't afford to, let them stop. I don't think American workers will do that. And you may be right.
And another, just from here before I go to the online, do please tell us who you are. And
yeah, I'm actual member of Upper Line of List. Basically, in your presentation, you did not elaborate on quantum technology and the challenge it may pose to EWS in the region. Hypothetically, should China gain command over the EWS spectrum, or I say the missile systems in the region, over dominance over the US, are they still going to agree or come to the same level of arrangement with the US? Or they may decide to dictate the pattern of the global order?
I mean, there are big questions a big question arising out of that, which is about what China ultimately wants to do. And China has been very coy on what its end game would look like. In one sense, they've been quite open. They want, they've said what sort of state they want to be by 2049, but they haven't actually said in terms, where in the global pecking order they aspire to be. And I think it's a moot point about whether they really want to be, number one, or they're content just to be a very, very big power in, their neck of the woods. On the technology side, I think, well, I mean, you mentioned quantum. I mean, quantum is one of these technologies with enormous potential, but there's only one real area where we're making practical headway on quantum, which is in quantum sensing. Even that's actually quite a sort of not a straightforward thing to do, but it is very effective in things like geolocation, orders of magnitude greater accuracy than is currently possible. China's also got something of an edge on quantum encryption. It's difficult to work out exactly how far ahead they are. But in general, quantum, I think the Chinese reckon that they're still well behind America.
Two questions from online, maybe I'll give you. The first is, can you yet divine any specific differences between the US and UK attitudes to this dilemma? Is there any subtle difference in the degree of de-risking or decoupling as between those two? And then the second question is, how do you expect, given your last point about the need for countries to choose, how Southeast Asia, whose 10 ASEAN members always say we never want to choose between the US and China, will tilt in this area? Yeah.
Okay. Well, the first one, I mean, I think the UK is still struggling to work out exactly what its posture is going to be. There's been a lot of work done and some quite sensible observations made by British ministers about where the UK should be vis-a-vis China. But of course, necessarily, the UK is in a very different position. The US is a superpower, and as Henry Kissinger observed, if there is one country in the world that can be an island, a more or less self-sufficient island republic, it would be the United States of America. The UK has no such option. It's an open, trading nation, and has to adopt a different approach when it comes to dealing with the rest of the world. I mean, I don't know how this is going to play out, because I don't think the Chinese have quite worked out what they want to do about the UK either, to be quite honest. What I find interesting is that latterly the Chinese seem to have cut the UK rather more slack than they have cut Europe in terms of some of the things that have divided the two. And I think ultimately they're more focused on the European Union because it's bigger, more powerful, and a more attractive partner for trading if they can still pull that off. What would China like to see? A UK that is untethered from the United States and hence more economically dependent upon China, most certainly. A UK that's less engaged in things like NATO, but what realistically they can expect, I don't think they themselves have quite got the measure of yet. On the second point about making choices, yes, well, China has proven latterly, I think, to be its own worst enemy within the region. There was a period during the 90s and early 2000s when China really, went hard on a good neighbors strategy, resolving border disputes and generally making accommodations with the countries of the region. They've gone off that now. And we're seeing a more I think it was well, at the Shangri-La dialogue, I think General Li Shangfu sort of hinted that the time was coming when the countries of the region would have to make a decision, if I'm not mistaken. And we saw recently Wang Yi talking to Japan and South Korea and saying, we'll never have big noses like the Europeans. Just get over it. They'll never accept you. You have to be prepared. It's Asia for the Asians. Is what we should be aspiring to. Obviously, I think China is going to vary its approach depending on the objective circumstances it finds itself in, but it's not going to let up on its basic posture of attempting to bring these countries within its own sphere. Countries of the region will want to resist as much as possible, but that then depends upon what the United States and its allies do in response. And I think generally, at the moment, that there is a lot more that needs to be done. I mean, US presidents have not been assiduous attenders at these ASEAN events where everybody stands, wearing ever more silly shirts and taking group photographs. And I think, it's only now just dawning on them that when it comes to the Southeast Asian region, as Woody Allen put it, 90% of life is about showing up, and actually showing up and taking an interest makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think my sort of tabloid summary of this has always been that China talks about a multipolar world, but wants a unipolar Asia. And
yes.
And the only thing that will prevent a unipolar Asia is the United States and other Western countries having a slightly better economic offering to the region, which is still not either on the cards or within the budgets. Anything from here? If not, then I'll ask one concluding question, which is, you spoke about the vibrant private sector in China. Is it really that vibrant? And is it not now in a situation where the private sector is being squeezed out of all possibility of freedom of maneuver or innovation that is necessary?
I don't think we're at that situation yet. I mean, it's certainly been the case that some aspects of Chinese private sector have come under a lot more scrutiny. In particular, those companies providing digital services. And this, I think, reflects the fact that Xi Jinping, as a true communist, sees industrial production as the kind of key link, if you like, and wants the private sector to focus on industrial production, making things rather than selling stuff. And I think those companies are not finding that they are operating in a more constrained environment. It's not obvious to me that this is the case. So it depends on the sector. I mean, China has some real problems with its financial sector, with property sector. These have acquired kind of casino-like characteristics, and Xi Jinping is understandably and probably correctly anxious to kind of crack down on that. But when it comes to companies that make things and innovate, I think yes, certainly there's been a greater focus on state-owned enterprises. That's certainly true. Their role has been strengthened and their capabilities strengthened. But there is still, I think, plenty of room for innovative entrepreneurs to operate successfully in China in the right areas, the ones where the party wants them to operate. And that is, I think, the key.
Well, thank you very much. Could I recommend that everybody actually both first buy and then read the book? The first time I ever saw the word nanometer even spelled out was when I read your book 2.5 years ago. I still can't remember exactly what the size of a nanometer is, but it's bloody small. Yeah. And thank you very much for explaining to us all this. People should understand this isn't just a book of political science, of international relations. It's one on which you will learn a great deal about the technologies at play. So I would give it an even stronger path than the many impressive other people who've endorsed this book have already. Nigel, thank you very much, not only for writing this book and speaking to us, but for staying on at the IISS as our important senior advisor on China and all things technological. We'll continue to rely on your briefings and expertise. And could you please all thank him for the presentation he's given to us today? Thank you very much.